I thought baking a cake for Sarah's birthday would be straightforward. Mix some sugar and flour, pop it in the oven, and voila, instant celebration. It was just supposed to be a nice little surprise, something homemade that showed I actually cared enough to try. But oh no, the kitchen had other plans, plans that looked suspiciously like a disaster movie set. It started innocently enough. I got all the ingredients lined up, like a soldier preparing for battle. Flour, sugar, eggs, butter, check, 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 check. My tiny apartment kitchen was neat, the counters gleaming, even a little too perfect. I had a vision, a gorgeous, flawless cake, something Sarah could Instagram and brag about forever. But then the first egg slipped. Now, cracking an egg sounds simple. You tap it on the edge, split it open, and in goes the yolk. Simple, elegant, except this one had a grudge. It shattered halfway, its jagged shell pieces diving into the bowl, threatening to ruin everything. I watched helplessly as the eggshell bits floated like strange little islands. Great, I muttered, poking around like I was defusing a bomb. Meanwhile, Alex, my younger brother, had decided his personal mission that day was to be everywhere I wasn't. I swear, he was like some kind of kitchen ninja, except instead of stealth, he was clumsy chaos incarnate. He peered over the counter, arms crossed, looking suspiciously like he wanted in on the cake making. I shooed him away, but then he disappeared only to reappear moments later with a goofy grin, wielding a spatula like a sword. On top of that, Mrs. Jenkins from downstairs had successfully transformed herself into the neighborhood's unofficial chief, Snoop. I caught her peeking through my kitchen window again, her eyes all squinty, pressing closer like she could taste the batter through the glass. I waved at her, which probably just encouraged more of the same. She waved back, but with that sort of knowing smirk that said, "Oh, I see what you're up to." By this point, my plan for a calm, perfect cake was gasping for air like it just survived a tornado. Then came the mixer. I figured if I couldn't be graceful with the eggs, I could at least save face by whipping the batter into submission. I cranked that mixer up and suddenly, flour exploded out of the bowl like it was staging a flower protest. White clouds billowed everywhere, settling on my hair, my face, the floor, and somehow into every corner of the apartment. Standing there looking like a ghost disguised as a baker, I just laughed. Or maybe it was a nervous breakdown pretending to be laughter. Alex was now beside me, gleefully scooping handfuls of flour from the floor and tossing them into the air like some sort of culinary snowstorm. "You need a hand?" he grinned, half teasing, half sincere. I was this close to telling him to stay out, but then I noticed how, even though the kitchen was turning into complete madness, having him there made everything a little less stressful. Before I could respond, there came a knock at the door. Not a quick tap or a timid peck. This was more like someone who had stories to tell and no time to waste. Mrs. Jenkins. And that's when I realized this simple goal of baking a perfect birthday cake was shaping up to be anything but simple. Honestly, I've never been much of a baker. I'm that person who thinks baking means pushing a frozen pizza in the oven and calling it a day. But Sarah's birthday? Well, that deserved something special. So I boldly declared I'd bake her a cake from scratch. The pressure was on bigger than I imagined. The first time tackling something like this, with everyone secretly expecting it to turn out amazing because, it was for Sarah. No pressure at all. I set up my tiny apartment kitchen like a makeshift bakery. Bags of flour and sugar lined up like soldiers. Butter softened on the windowsill. Eggs precariously perched on the counter. I watched a couple of YouTube tutorials on how to bake a perfect cake, though at this point I wasn't sure I could even do how to crack an egg without accidentally flooding the countertop. Speaking of eggs, that first one alone nearly toppled my confidence. I tapped the shell on the edge of the bowl, half expecting golden, perfect yolk to slip in like a dream. Instead, the shell fractured in a way I didn't think was physically possible, sharp shards dropping, soaking into the fluffy white flour already waiting in the bowl. It was like the egg was sabotaging me on purpose. I fished out pieces, ducking shells like I was performing delicate surgery, my hands trembling slightly because honestly, every second I stared at that mess, my vision of perfect birthday cake blurred further into some kind of kitchen nightmare. All the while, my younger brother Alex was prowling around like a hyperactive cat who just discovered the kitchen was an obstacle course. I caught him lurking behind the fridge, then peeking over my shoulder, then disappearing again like a magician's apprentice trying not to get burned. He pounced back into view, this time armed with a spatula like some kind of batter-wielding warrior. His grin was the kind that warned me there would be trouble, but also maybe a little unexpected help. I was this close to telling him to scram when I glimpsed that mischievous sparkle in his eyes and figured, what's the worst that could happen? Oh, and then there was Mrs. Jenkins, our nosy neighbor. She's the kind of person who looks like she might knit sweaters with binoculars inside the sleeves. I caught her again, pressing her face up against my kitchen window, squinting like she was trying to decode the secrets of baking through the glass. I waved and she waved back, but with that smirk that said, I know exactly what you're up to and I'm judging. Try as I might to focus on the cake, her silent judgment felt like a third party watching over my shoulder. And honestly, it was kind of unsettling. The next big hurdle was the mixer. I thought, okay, just whip this batter up fast, clean, and smooth, and I'll be back on track. I cranked the speed higher than I probably should have, and in an instant, flour erupted from the bowl like a mini volcanic explosion. Suddenly, my entire kitchen was blanketed in white powder. Flour dust floated lazily as it settled on the countertops, the floor, my hair, my face. Heck, I'm pretty sure some even landed on my phone and sent it into a slow death spiral. At that moment, I looked in the mirror above the sink, caught my reflection covered in flour, and laughed. It might have been nervous laughter or the first step before a complete meltdown, but I decided to count it as a win. Alex was now giddy beside me, scooping globs of flour from the floor and hurling them into the air, making it snow like some kind of mini winter wonderland. Played a hand? He asked, grinning like a kid about to pull off the greatest prank ever. I was ready to say, no thanks, I got this, but then I realized something. Even if the kitchen was a complete mess and the cake looked like a science experiment gone wrong, having him there pulled some of the pressure off. Somehow, it didn't seem as overwhelming with that goofball turning disaster into a game. Then, just as I was about to coax him away from the flour fight, there was an insistent knock at the door. Not a gentle, hey, do you have time? Type knock. No, this was a drop everything and open up kind of knock, and there she was, Mrs. Jenkins, standing there like she was auditioning for the role of party crasher. At that moment, I realized this so-called simple birthday cake mission was turning out to be something way more interesting and chaotic than I'd ever imagined. With Mrs. Blaze Jenkins on the doorstep, I was suddenly caught between a rock and a hard place, or more accurately, a door and a flour-covered kitchen. I opened it cautiously, trying to look like the sane adult in control of events when, in reality, I was anything but. Oh, I just smelled something divine from downstairs and thought I'd pop up to see if you needed any help, she said, her eyes gleaming like she was hunting for gossip instead of cake. And maybe a glass of milk? Baking always makes me thirsty. I forced a smile, silently thanking the universe for small mercies, because honestly, I could use a distraction from my batter disaster. Mrs. Jenkins stepped inside like she owned the place, her eyes immediately scanning the snowy battlefield that had once been my kitchen counter. Don't you just love the smell of baking? She declared, swiping a finger through the flour floating in the air and then rubbing it between her hands like it was some gourmet spice. Reminds me of when I was a girl, before ovens had timers and no one knew what gluten was. I nodded, wiping flour from my forehead, trying to ignore the sticky patch of batter that had decided to set in my hair. Alex, of course, wasn't about to miss an audience. He took this as his cue to introduce Mrs. Past Jenkins to his latest creation, a flour snow angel he'd made right there on the floor. Mrs. Jenkins chuckled, deep and genuine, as if Alex's impromptu art project was the highlight of her day. Well, looks like you two are having quite the party ahead of Sarah's birthday. I tried to smooth the flour dust from my shirt and said, more like a disaster, but we're getting there. And then, as if the universe heard me and decided to up the stakes, Alex, in a moment of supreme enthusiasm, attempted to help by grabbing the nearly full bowl of batter to mix by hand while I was distracted chatting with Mrs. Heine. Jenkins! What followed was a slow-motion catastrophe. The bowl tilted, batter sloshed, and before anyone could blink, a thick, gloopy wave of cake batter cascaded off the edge of the counter, landing square on the floor with an impressive splat. Jenkins gasped, her eyes wide as saucers, while I just stood there, mouth slightly open, caught somewhere between horror and helpless laughter. Alex looked equally horrified, then shrugged and said, well, that's one way to test if the floor likes cake. Mrs. Jenkins crouched down carefully, poking at the mess with her shoe before looking up at me with that unmistakable twinkle of mischief. You know, sometimes the best recipes are born from a bit of chaos. I blinked, realizing that this disaster-filled kitchen party was turning out to be way less about perfection and way more about the unexpected moments, like an impromptu visit from a nosy neighbor who actually wanted to help, or my little brother's gleeful willingness to jump in, even if he made things messier. I glanced at the clock. Time was ticking. The cake still needed to bake and somehow be assembled without resembling the aftermath of a storm. Mrs. Jenkins gave me a wink, and Alex picked up the spatula, ready to dive back into the flour frenzy. Despite the batter carnage and the mixer mishap, the cracked eggshells strewn about, and the unexpected flour fight, I thought, maybe, just maybe, we were on the verge of pulling something off, or at least making a memorable mess in the process. When the timer finally beeped, I approached the oven with a mix of dread and hope, as if I were about to unveil some fragile creature rather than a cake. Opening the door, I was greeted not by a smooth, golden masterpiece, but something that resembled a deflated soufflé that had just survived a wrestling match. Its surface was uneven, pocked with cracks and a suspiciously burnt edge that looked like a little black mustache drawn by a mischievous toddler. I sighed, feeling that familiar sting of disappointment tug at my chest. But then I heard Sarah's voice from the living room, full of warmth and laughter. She hadn't even seen the cake yet, but just knowing she was there, excited about this silly, chaotic effort, gave me a little spark of courage. I carefully lifted the cake out of the pan with a little help from Alex, who insisted on wearing oven mitts decorated with cartoon flames, and set it on the counter. It looked like someone had tried to paint abstract art with frosting. The icing was uneven, patches of bright pink clashed with blobs of white, and the sprinkles had somehow migrated to the floor and my hair. Just as I was about to crumble it up and serve it as an apology, Sarah walked in, eyes wide and smiling. "Wow, is this the cake or a modern art piece?" she teased, stepping closer. I shrugged, a grin cracking across my face. "A little of both, honestly." Without hesitation, she grabbed a fork and took a bite, a playfully skeptical look softening into genuine delight. "Okay, it's definitely not perfect, but it tastes amazing. And it means a lot that you made this for me." At that moment, the kitchen chaos seemed to fade into the background. Mrs. Jenkins popped in with a plate and offered her own enthusiastic approval. "You know, sweetie, sometimes the best memories come from the messiest kitchens," she said, wiping a speck of flour off her cheek and chuckling. Alex chimed in, striking a mock heroic pose with his spatula. "And the best helpers make the biggest messes." Laughter filled the apartment, blossoming into something warm and real. The cake might not have won any baking contests, but it was a symbol of everything we'd wrapped up in this wild day. The laughter between fumbling hands, the surprise visits, and the willingness to dive headfirst into the unknown. Looking back, it wasn't about perfect edges or flawless frosting. It was about showing up, making a mess, and somehow coming out of it with more than just a cake. A story worth sharing, a memory dusted with flour and laughter, and a friendship that could survive even the biggest baking disasters.